Tonight we begin with a policy shift that transportation officials, state legislators, and safety advocates had warned about, debated over, and anticipated for years. A regulatory transformation that unfolded not over decades of discussion, but in 18 months of accelerated legislative action. 18 months that will reshape mobility for millions. 18 months that will redefine independence for America's fastest growing demographic. 18 months that will force families across the nation to have conversations they've been avoiding. What state legislatures did this year crossed a line that senior advocacy groups had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, departments of motor vehicles did not hesitate. They responded with mandatory retesting, progressive license restrictions, and comprehensive medical clearance requirements. For nearly a decade now, there had been indicators, not official legislation, not formal policy announcements, just data patterns and pilot programs, that state governments were preparing something unprecedented in American driving law. Transportation departments have been cautious, yes, but they have been methodical in their caution. Their policy proposals have followed a certain rhythm, a progression, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in state houses and senior centers this past year was that the rhythm went silent. Policy analysts who monitor age-related driving legislation know the indicators. The incremental pilot programs in select counties, the research studies commissioned without fanfare. The quiet meetings between DMV officials and geriatric specialists. The sudden bipartisan consensus, all of that went quiet. And whenever legislative momentum goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early this year, transportation safety boards detected what they described as statistically significant accident patterns, including collision rates among drivers over 75 that had not been acknowledged in official policy debates in over 30 years. These are the kinds of statistics that lawmakers only reference publicly when they are signaling something very specific: imminent policy change, constituent pressure response, or electoral positioning. Policy watchers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that state legislatures were changing their regulatory posture. And when government bodies shift regulatory posture without extensive public comment periods, even by small measures, senior advocacy organizations pay attention. The legislative wave issued by 17 state legislatures this year was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was comprehensive. Transportation committee after committee described the new restrictions as evidence-based, age-neutral in language, but age-specific in impact. And perhaps most importantly, unavoidable given demographic projections showing that by 2030, 1 in 5 drivers will be over 65. But policy reform only works if the affected population accepts it. Senior driver communities did not. In fact, their organized response this year was among the most coordinated we've seen in transportation policy advocacy. Here's what we know. Within 6 months of the first major state passage, senior organizations mobilized letter-writing campaigns, town halls, and legal challenges. These weren't the typical advocacy efforts. These were coalition-driven movements, networks that senior advocacy groups only deploy when they are preparing to challenge legislation at the constitutional level. This month, departments of motor vehicles confirmed that states are implementing tiered restriction systems on license renewals, including vision test requirements that had recently been strengthened for what analysts believe was age-related macular degeneration prevalence. States are implementing restrictions before opposition groups can mount successful legal challenges. They're targeting renewal cycles. They're targeting medical certification requirements. They're targeting road test components that were likely preparing to grandfather existing license holders. In other words, legislators targeted the administrative infrastructure, the documentation systems that would make exemptions difficult. This is what made advocacy groups' warnings so urgent. State legislatures' restriction packages weren't just symbolic. They were immediately enforceable. They represented the kind of regulatory framework that could restrict mobility within a single renewal cycle if left unchallenged. And senior advocacy organizations, understanding that fully, responded with organizing. Not emotionally, not desperately, but strategically. They didn't challenge the safety data. They didn't dismiss the statistical evidence. They challenged the implementation timeline. They challenged the lack of alternative transportation infrastructure. And here's where the story becomes even more complex. Transportation researchers now believe that legislators' latest restrictions were designed to test the political tolerance of senior voters after recent elections showed declining turnout among older demographics. Lawmakers wanted to see whether senior advocacy groups would mount sustained opposition. But instead, the opposite happened. Senior organizations didn't fragment into competing priorities. They unified behind a coordinated strategy that was so focused, so legally sophisticated, that even legislative sponsors noticed. You don't get a state legislature's attention easily after a bill passes, but this year, senior advocates did. Policy analysts speaking with transportation media under anonymity described lawmakers' approach as preemptive regulation, a way to address projected safety concerns before they become electoral liabilities. But senior communities proved this year that they remain both organized and influential. Their advocacy campaigns were not only vocal, they were targeted so precisely that 3 states have already delayed implementation timelines. That timing matters because it shows strategic coordination. It shows that senior advocacy networks are not reactive constituencies. They are proactive political forces. As reports continued coming in throughout the legislative session, we learned more about the scale of the restriction packages. California implemented mandatory cognitive screening every 2 years for drivers over 70, forcing changes to 2.4 million license renewal schedules. Florida targeted night driving privileges that had been unrestricted in the last 4 decades. Texas, operating through county-level DMV offices, reportedly introduced reaction time testing used by commercial driver programs to evaluate senior license holders. This wasn't just license renewal reform. This wasn't just vision test updates. This was comprehensive age-correlated regulation. This was graduated restriction architecture. And graduated restriction architecture is the one thing senior drivers have struggled to navigate since these policies began implementation. For every accommodation they have requested, state DMVs have countered with standardized testing protocols that eliminate discretionary exceptions. Remember, senior advocacy groups thought these restrictions would remain recommendations. They thought political pressure would slow implementation. They thought demographic voting power would create legislative hesitation. But this year, the exact opposite is happening. Restrictions are becoming law. Implementation is accelerating, and demographic voting power hasn't prevented passage. What makes this moment so consequential and so personal is that state legislatures' restriction packages happened at a time when the senior population is under unprecedented mobility pressure. Rural seniors want public transportation alternatives. Urban seniors want accessible ride-sharing options. Suburban seniors want graduated restriction programs. Medical professionals want evidence-based assessment protocols. Legislators are balancing these demands while facing insurance industry lobbying and transportation safety advocacy pressure. And when lawmakers in that position make sudden regulatory moves, they're not doing it from electoral strength. They're doing it from liability concerns. They're doing it from actuarial pressure. The American Association of Retired Persons policy statement, now distributed to all 50 state chapters, was designed to signal that senior advocacy organizations are not willing to accept restriction without accommodation. AARP officials said plainly that legislators' restriction packages were inconsistent with adequate public transportation infrastructure development. That is advocacy organization language for, you can't restrict driving without providing viable alternatives. You don't usually hear that directness from AARP unless something fundamental is at stake. Meanwhile, AARP's chief advocacy officer addressed member organizations in a measured, legally precise statement this month. She said, "We recognize the legitimate safety concerns that drive this legislation." She said, "But we will not accept mobility restrictions without corresponding infrastructure investment." And she said, "The right to independence doesn't expire at 65. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from an organization that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. State legislatures' restriction packages weren't isolated, along with driving restrictions. Insurance companies also increased premiums for drivers over 70 by an average of 23%. Medical boards introduced mandatory physician reporting requirements for cognitive decline. Technology companies increased development of autonomous vehicle services targeting senior markets. All of this happened within the same 18-month period. When multiple sectors move simultaneously on senior mobility, it means something larger is underway. Transportation analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that states are preparing for automated vehicle integration that will reduce senior driving necessity. Another is that legislators are attempting to preempt liability concerns before baby boomer accident rates peak statistically. A third possibility, the one worrying senior advocates the most, is that states are attempting to reduce road infrastructure costs by decreasing the senior driver population. But this year, senior organizations took the narrative control off the table. They didn't accept restrictions passively. They didn't fragment into competing priorities. They didn't limit advocacy to individual states. They coordinated nationally. What we're watching now is a test of political influence across generational lines. State legislators want to see whether restrictions can be implemented without electoral consequences. Senior advocates want to show that mobility restrictions mobilize voters. Transportation safety groups want to prevent accident rate increases. And insurance companies want to prevent liability exposure growth. Tonight, we've heard from policy implementation offices who are now monitoring senior license renewal patterns. They say compliance rates remain high. They say legal challenges are proceeding through state courts. And they say legislators' decision to implement restrictions is likely part of broader transportation policy modernization intended to prepare infrastructure for demographic aging. But senior communities are not accepting restrictions without resistance. In fact, senior advocacy networks are expanding coalition partnerships. Their response this year, organized, legally sophisticated, and politically coordinated, sent a message to state legislatures that demographic voting power remains relevant. And it sent a message to transportation departments that implementation without accommodation will face sustained challenge. As the implementation period continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly legislators hope to achieve. But what we do know is that senior advocacy organizations' coordinated response was timely. It prevented immediate universal implementation. It created space for accommodation negotiation. And it established that mobility restrictions require infrastructure alternatives. What happens next will depend on what state legislatures do in the next legislative session. If they incorporate accommodation provisions, this moment will be remembered as collaborative policy reform. If they proceed with restriction-only approaches, senior advocacy organizations have already shown they are mobilized. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in decades, senior advocacy organizations appear to be unified. Legislative tracking offices are quiet, too quiet. And when policy implementation offices are quiet, it means they are analyzing resistance patterns. It means they are choosing their next regulatory moves carefully. Because this year, state legislators learned something they have learned many times throughout American political history. Demographic voting blocks matter, organized advocacy works, and mobility is not negotiable. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Senior drivers are preparing, their advocates are organizing, and the conversation about age, safety, and independence has only just begun. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.